Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning to talk about flood justice. We have an hour for this call. We have four fantastic panelists. They're going to share some introductory remarks, and then we'll reserve the second half of the call for questions and answers. And we'll prioritize questions from reporters during that second half of the call. My name is Nicole Lampe. I head the Water Hub at Climate Nexus, and I'm super excited to be joined today by Melissa Roberts, who is founder and executive director of American Flood Coalition. American Flood Coalition is a nonpartisan group of political, military, business, and other leaders working to advance adaptation in flood-affected communities. We also have Catherine Eagland, who is program director and co-founder of educational, environmental, economic community health organization in Gulfport, Mississippi. She also chairs the Environmental and Climate Justice Committee for the National Board of Directors of the NAACP. Harriet Festing is executive director and co-founder of Anthropocene Alliance, the nation's largest coalition of frontline communities fighting for climate and environmental justice. And finally, David Southgate is a member of the board of directors as well as climate adaptation advisor for Nuevo, Amanecer, a community-rooted nonprofit serving Playa de Ponce, the coastal barrio in Puerto Rico, where President Biden visited following Hurricane Fiona. And the topic today is flood justice. Obviously, it's been a very wet spring and winter in much of the country, from atmospheric rivers in California to record snowpack in the Colorado Basin to the Mississippi River swinging between drought last summer and flooding this spring. And of course, news that sea levels are rising faster than expected and 3 times the global average in the US Gulf Coast. And then finally, most recently, news that flood insurance rates are going to spike next year, going up as much as 600% in some counties on account of previously underestimated flood risk. We know that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by flooding, and so we're super excited to be joined today by local leaders from, as I said, Gulfport, Mississippi, and Playa de Ponce, as well as leaders who work nationally in many other communities on flood preparedness and prevention. I want to turn first to Melissa Roberts from American Flood Coalition for a bit of a nationwide perspective. Melissa, I know that American Flood Coalition has hundreds of members across the country. Can you please share what you're hearing from your network in terms of flood risks facing communities and the challenges they have in preparing?
Yeah, thanks for having me here today and putting this together to talk about this. So what I would say is, it's interesting is we have this really diverse coalition, right? So we have 360 plus members across 22 states, coastal, inland, riverine, and we're hearing really, really similar themes, despite how diverse our coalition members are. And most of what we hear is, these impacts have really accelerated in the last 5 years. So we're talking about water in people's basements, at people's doorsteps, in the street, preventing people from getting to work. And what we hear from a lot of the local leaders we work with is that this issue is scientifically complicated. It's hard for elected leaders to communicate it well. It's difficult to know what the solution is. And even when a community knows they need to plant mangroves to reduce storm surge impacts or raise a wastewater treatment plant, it's really hard to pay for it. And even when we know that we have their money available at the state and federal level, it's almost impossible to navigate all of the hurdles to actually get that funding down to the community. And these aren't new. All of these reasons are why we formed the coalition in the first place 5 years ago, because what we were hearing from a lot of local leaders was, honestly, this problem is so difficult. I'm going to hope the next flood happens when I'm not in office, because they were being given so little support. But we've really seen this accelerate, right? We've seen higher seas, stronger storms, more frequent flooding, and not a lot of support going to these communities. There's obviously an opportunity to change this now, but what we're hearing working in communities is, we hear the news about major hurricanes, but we don't hear as much about all of the years that happen after the flood fades from the headlines, right? the mold in houses, the health impacts, the enormous financial and emotional toll of frequent flooding that's now happening weekly in some places, even on sunny days. And of course, where you started, we know the toll of flooding disproportionately impacts underserved communities, and that current adaptation policy has exacerbated this inequality.
Thank you so much. What do you see now as the opportunity to build resilience, and how is American Flood Coalition helping members tap into federal infrastructure dollars?
So we're incredibly excited about the opportunity, right? By our count, we're looking at over $100 billion across programs for adaptation and resilience. That's a historic moment of opportunity. It's incredible. But we also really need to be conscious of history and how this has played out in the past. We know underserved communities that need this money the most have traditionally been left out. So AFC is really focused on who can access this moment and making sure the money gets to communities who need it most. Because in our current system, unfortunately, you need money to get money. You need to be able to pay for consultants and site studies and grant writers to have a shot at getting federal dollars. And when you don't have that, even if you're most at risk and need it the most, you're often left out. So at AFC, we're kind of addressing this in two ways, both deeply at the local level and to inform systems change. So at the local level, this week, we're really excited to be launching our Flood Resilient Communities cohort with support from the Kresge Foundation. So this is working with a group of 5 underserved communities in North and South Carolina, addressing one of the most common problems we hear across our coalition, which is there's so much work that has to happen before you can get to grants.gov. A lot of communities, even when there's money available, will say, we don't have a project to put forward. We don't know which funding stream to even look at. And so this is really common, and we're excited to be kind of investing on the front end and looking at how we can bring in the community with the city from the beginning in a co-governance process, and actually kind of flipping that process on its head, not doing community outreach at the end, but in the beginning and trying to solve this problem. But I think more importantly, I'd say we're also looking at the big picture about driving transformational policy change. Right now, getting federal dollars is a marathon. And groups like ours are saying, all right, you need to run this marathon. We're going to get you a nutritionist and a trainer and get you over the finish line. But I think we need to step back and say, why are we making all these communities run a marathon when it should be a 5K? We have to make sure these programs actually serve the communities that need it most on the front lines. And we can't just throw more technical assistance to get folks through a system we know is broken. We need to actually substantially change the system. And that's what we're trying to do. And I know others here are too, through our cohort work and our broader coalition work, looking at kind of identifying procedural stumbling blocks that keep folks out. Things like 500-page applications with 200 pages of instructions and 31 steps. Until we change that, the odds are just going to be stacked against you if you don't have the money to pay for outside consultants and grant writers. So for us, we're really invested in the local work to capture the opportunity of this moment, but we're more focused on this idea of we need to transform the system so that we can actually have equitable outcomes.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I want to turn now to Catherine Egeland from Gulfport, Mississippi, a community that has run this marathon and been able to secure some federal dollars for flood preparedness work. As I said, Catherine is program director and co-founder of Educational, Environmental, Economic, and Community Health Organization. Catherine, can you talk to us first about Gulfport, Mississippi, and share what has been the community's experience with flooding and what's at stake there in terms of homes, history, and culture?
Sure. Let me give a bit of a background information on Gulfport. We were actually the community hit hardest by Hurricane Katrina. Most people are familiar with New Orleans, but people are really surprised when to hear that it was Mississippi that actually took the brunt of that storm. Was the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And prior to Hurricane Katrina, there was Hurricane Camille in 1969 that had been the most devastating storm. So we had a lot of people who felt that that was going to be the worst storm that we would ever experience. And that caused quite a few deaths in this area because people thought that their homes had withstood Hurricane Camille, so they would be fine during Hurricane Camille. Well, a lot of people did not take into account or just were not familiar with sea level rise. And with, the onset of sea level rise, we had flooding in places that had never flooded before. And that caught a lot of people off guard. A lot of people climbed on treetops, climbed on their rooftops because they were experiencing flooding, unexpected flooding. Since that time, and I will say that actually I lost two of my dearest family friends to drowning death. Their home had withstood Hurricane Camille, and climbing into their attics didn't save them during Hurricane Katrina. And since Hurricane Katrina, we have had the problem not only with the sea level rise, but with development. And this is what is happening to our communities. One of the communities that we serve, the Forest Heights community, has historical significance in that it was the first of its kind venture with HUD and the National Council of Negro Women. It was the first housing development of its kind. It was the first integrated housing development. All of those homes, all but 4 of those 200 plus homes were destroyed to flooding during Hurricane Katrina. Since that time, because of all of the development in that area, has created so much impervious surfaces that the residents have experienced exacerbated flooding. And there's still proposals for even more development. At this time, we are experiencing 2 different cases that will cause exacerbated flooding. We're not opposed to development. There are actually alternative sites where these developments can be completed that will not pose flooding threats to communities. But that's one of the largest threats that they have. And the Forest Heights community, and then we have the historic Turkey Creek community. And all of these communities in the North Gulfport areas that are in the Turkey Creek watershed are at risk of flooding, and they are under continuous watch. And it's really sad because even now, you don't even have to have storms. Even during heavy rains, you have a Forest Heights Baptist Church that immediately start putting sandbags at their doors. A couple of years ago, I went there after a hard rain, and there were live fish swimming in the parking lot of the church because of the flooding situation. So they dodged a few bullets in a sense, in that the water hasn't entered the church. It's gone inches from entering the church. And that's just with hard rain. So we are in a hurricane prone area, and we need to do quite a bit. We are now, and as Melissa said, trying to get funding is so difficult from the federal government. Trying to get funding to be more resilient, to mitigate the flooding, to adapt to the impacts of sea level rise, that's been very difficult. Communities just really don't have the expert. We have a lot of expertise, but when it comes to grant writing, I can tell you without Harriet and Anthropocene Alliance, ECHO would not have been able to be positioned to secure federal funding in order to prevent some of these flooding or mitigate some of the flooding. And so we are looking at quite a few things that we, in addition to trying to stave off some of these developments, we're looking at trying to do some other things to get community involved as well, planting trees, beneficial grasses, bioswales. So there are quite a few things that we are engaging with our community in an effort to try to have them trained and educated in what we can do as a community as well. But we definitely need government assistance in order to make this happen.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So am I right in thinking that ECHO received coastal resilience funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in 2022? And can you talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing with communities, the specific solutions that you're planning?
Sure. And we haven't actually received it. We're in the process. So we don't have the money in the bank, but we have the plans in the work, and we're going to try and make this happen. We're working with scientists and other people in this field, restoration, who do actual restoration work, and trying to get the community involved and get, as I mentioned earlier, trying to have beneficial grasses planted, trying to do tree planting, bioswales, just a variety of solutions to flooding, to address flooding issues in Gulfport, because it's prevalent in the North Gulfport area, especially. And, you can go back to the history of these areas where that pre-segregation era, where we still have the same zoning in place during redlining. If you look at a map of the redlining and a map of the flood-prone areas, they're going to be virtually the same. And so this is why, federal funding is so important. People invested in their property. They've handed them down from generation to generation. This is home. Buyout is not an option for most people because, like I said, these are family homes.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Catherine mentioned that ECHO received some help with grant writing from Harriet Festing's organization, Anthropocene Alliance. I'd love to turn now to you, Harriet. Since A2 is a national network of frontline organizations, can you please share some big picture perspectives on the kinds of communities being hit first and worst by storms and sea level rise, and then talk about how you are helping to get money to the ground in those hotspots?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. So as you mentioned, we're an alliance. We have 160 climate and environmental justice members. They come from 38 US states, territories, and tribal nations. They're impacted by wildfire, heat, drought, and toxic contamination, but about 2/3 are impacted by flooding. So it's a big issue for our members. And the big picture of what that looks like actually is best told and is for us experienced through the individual stories of our members. And those are sort of a mixed story, a story of extraordinarily inspiring leaders, some leaders who are now finally getting access to federal funding. We are tremendously grateful for that funding. But also the total inadequacy of federal government to put in the regulations that need to be in place to actually continue to protect them from harm. And so you've heard from Catherine, and you will hear from David Southgate, but maybe just two other quick examples of those stories. Susan Liley is from the Citizens Committee for Flood Relief in DeSoto, Missouri. It's a white working class city with the poorest people just kind of sandwiched in between a creek that suffers from severe flash flooding and the Union Pacific Railway lines. So it's dangerous. Upstream from them are 15 high hazardous dams. There's contamination from mining. Several people have died, 200 properties at risk. We have helped them. They've got HUD funding to now do green infrastructure planning. They've had extensive work done to help them understand which properties need to be bought out. But FEMA, despite the fact that they're repetitive, lost properties, FEMA has not been able to find the funding to get those homes bought out. So they're a long way along a path, but upstream, just like Catherine Eggeland, upstream development is making their problems worse. That could be halted by development in the NFIP regulations, and continual homes that flood keep selling and get recycled to new homeowners who don't know of the problem. So it's like this vicious cycle, and it's really tragic. Rebecca Jim, another one of the communities we work with, she represents lead agency in Miami, Oklahoma. Rebecca is herself a member of the Cherokee Nation. Miami is headquarters of 9 tribal nations, yeah. And when they flood, when Miami floods, you know, those kind of horror story photos, aerial photos you see of just the tops of properties. That's what flooding looks like in Miami. They're moving, and they're also adjacent to one of the largest Superfund sites in the nation, which means that every time it floods, contaminated floodwaters go back to flood, to contaminate the very homes that EPA has just been cleaning up. We've made huge strides. They've done flood risk mapping. They've mapped out the buyout of homes. They've done a lot of work on green infrastructure. We've just resubmitted a large funding proposal to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for much larger planning and start to move to implementation. Meanwhile, the city continues to put new development in flood-prone areas. That's allowed by the National Flood Insurance Program. It uses this approach called fill and build. So that's particularly loved by developers. It allows them to bring in vast amounts of dirt fill, pile up their new houses on that, displacing floodwaters onto existing homes. And again, homes are being recycled that are flood prone because of lack of disclosure laws. And this shenanigans of their governor, which is allowing Grand Lake, which is for the wealthy property owners, it's going to raise the lake 2 foot, which will actually result in an additional 2 foot of flooding of the poor homes. It's essentially flooding poor people out, just like Catherine Eglin's situation.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Lastly, I want to turn to David Southgate from Nuevo Amanecer in Playa de Ponce in Puerto Rico. David, Playa de Ponce is one of those flooding hotspots that Harriet was talking about. Would love for you to talk about the damage from Hurricane Fiona and how that storm impacted different neighborhoods. But you also were mentioning that it's not just mega storms, that, you know, even a heavy rain like in Gulfport, Mississippi can cause water to back up. So would love to just hear how flooding is impacting residents there.
That's correct, Nicole. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today, and hello to my colleagues with Anthropocene Alliance, and Catherine, good to see you. So in the aftermath of the September 21st, 2022 Hurricane Fiona, we had 30 inches of rainfall in basically a period of 24 hours, which much exceeded the rainfall that we saw during Hurricane Maria, which had the terrible winds. And this rainfall for the September storm, plus sea surge, inundated many of the 19 communities in Playa de Ponce, which is the largest South Puerto Rico coastal barrio. We've been documenting neighborhood flood observations for the past 3 years, so we knew where flooding was likely to occur. But similar to Gulfport's experience with new flood areas, Fiona really surprised us with flooding in additional areas. And after Fiona, it was very, very sad to encounter people like neighbor Don Mendez, whose home is still damaged from Hurricane Maria nearly 6 years, 6 years later, and countless others who after Fiona went to sleep again, hungry, on wet beds, wet clothing, with no electricity, their food beginning to rot. Just dreadful circumstances. And then, as you mentioned, even a tropical rain event like the one that occurred just 2 days ago. Neighbors in the Puerto Viejo communities within our barrio, as well as Salistral, friends and neighbors like Maria and Miriam, as well as Miguel Angel, had to cope with flooding. But not just that, they also had to cope with the aftermath of the flood, sewage-tainted waters that left an incredible stench and a health hazard of sewage sewage material just outside their front doors, literally. They would have to step on it to go out, and the smell is indescribable. Yet this is America, and this is, I think, what environmental racism looks like. We've got in Playa de Ponce about 11,000 residents living the legacy of planned and coercive displacement in what amounts to land grabs. So this flooding has a context. And in the last 40 years, at least 6 of the economically distressed poor Latino communities within our barrio have been expropriated from their homes in the name of economic development. In this case, the growth of a deep water port. Some 2,000 residents of our barrios communities, such as Santo Domingo, these places no longer exist. Santo Domingo was a neighborhood here, Haiti, Villa Lili, Las Latas, Las Potes, Los Meritos, and others. So today, the government's climate change agenda has reframed displacement as voluntary. But I ask you, if your neighbors cannot get the assistance to rebuild after superstorms and catastrophic floods, and the protective infrastructure that's supposed to be there for us is falling to bits, what are you going to do? Is it voluntary? Consequently, nearly 200 households have abandoned their homes, a fact that we documented just last year in our community-driven inventory of abandoned properties across our barrio.
Thank you, David. Would love to hear you talk now about how Nuevo Amanecer is thinking about building resilience and how federal funding will help.
Sure. So just to frame this a little bit, so the government has been denying our neighbors protective infrastructure, and thus displacement isn't voluntary. And so this government inaction might be considered oppressive. It's coercive through inaction. And we've got the issues of government decisions where to invest in federal recovery dollars being based upon old and incorrect FEMA maps. So the government, in some senses, has long abandoned communities like ours. And now it's up for the people on the front lines of climate change to adapt on their own. We are a small nonprofit organization. We just got our 501c3 in November. We're all volunteer. And so in terms of staff resources and expertise, there's a real wide chasm of inequality as a community organization. And then climate adaptation is really a matter of injustice at the end of the day with this kind of framing. So Nuevo Amanecer, this community-rooted nonprofit, connected with Anthropocene Alliance in around 2020, and thus a network of also frontline climate leaders, such as Susan, that Harriet mentioned, such as Rebecca, such as my colleague Catherine, who's here with us. And so we've been able to secure $1.1 million worth of funding and technical assistance to support community-driven planning processes. These projects are really coming online now. So it's kind of a long process, but it's exciting. So we're really focused on improving the circumstances of our communities through community-led adaptation planning and decision-making, covering things like community resilience planning and actually defining what does resilience mean for us? Does it mean bouncing back equally, in dreadful circumstances, or does it mean bouncing back better? Green and blue-green infrastructure is going to be supported with this NIFWIF grant that was recently announced, the National Coastal Resiliency Fund. And so we are really hoping to produce neighborhood needs assessments, but also discreetly fundable adaptation projects that can be green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure. If we're talking about restoring the industrial damage to our bay, that natural infrastructure served in the past to reduce the wave action coming to shore and thus protecting us. The U.S. Corps of Army Engineers is doing a floodplain management survey that just began. And so we're hoping to see a mix of different kinds of projects there as well, including some great infrastructure pieces, and then household level strategies. And we're also looking at land recycling for possible community benefit. And thus, that's the reason why we've been counting these abandoned sites. And we continue to do our ongoing mutual aid, which was sort of the founding nature of our organization. And so we're hoping to tap and control in some ways the way that infrastructure investments could occur in our community. And very much like Catherine said, people have a very deep attachment to their place here in the barrio. I've never seen anything like it. I've lived here 23 years. I love it. My neighbors are deeply rooted with the traditions and the cultures that are a little bit different in our barrio than even the rest of our municipality and the area. So it's an exciting moment in time, and we're really hopeful.
Thank you so much, David. We welcome questions now, either through the Q&A or through the chat. I have one to get us, or a couple to get us started, actually. David and Catherine, you both talked about how these places like Ponce and Forest Heights are homes. And so relocation to higher ground isn't what many residents wanted. And then you talked about green or blue-green infrastructure. I wonder if you could sort of paint a picture of what are you building? Catherine, you mentioned bioswales, and how things like, parks, rain gardens, community gardens, living shorelines, David, that you referenced, like how do they help? And how do they, how are you, what is it, what other needs besides flood protection are they meeting for residents?
Let me mention, Echo proudly had groundbreaking of a garden that we on Earth Day in 2016. And this is a story of how you can take lemons and make lemonade. The site of our community garden was a buyout site. It was a site where there was constant flooding, and they tore all the houses down. There was no more impervious surface, and our garden is flourishing. So we went to the city and we asked for a site. We asked them to help us with some irrigation as the site of our community garden. So the first really tropical rain that we had, we immediately went out to the property to see if our garden had flooded, but fortunately it had not flooded. So we realized that, without the impervious surface, we were going to be successful. So that's certainly having a community garden. It helps not only with flooding, but it helps with food scarcity as well. So we are looking also at, as you mentioned, the rain gardens and the bioswales. And I think having these in such a way that we can put it into the neighborhood landscape to make it attractive. And I will say this, during the buyout from that particular area, most people are really apprehensive now because the people were not given enough money to relocate. And whereas their homes may have been paid off, they were retired, and now they're in a situation after the buyout where they have a mortgage because they did not have enough money. They're having to live in smaller homes because they were just not given the amount of money. And this has caused other people to be very cautious. Now, some communities, such as the Turkey Creek, that was a community that was established by free, emancipated African Americans. And that's a source of pride in that community. And that's a history of that community. People used to be baptized in Turkey Creek before it was so contaminated. And that's a part of history. And what we should be doing is trying to preserve that history, the history of Forest Heights, the history of Turkey Creek. And whereas we have government that's giving funding on one hand, now, we're saying that this is the Environmental Justice Administration, but you can't at the same time fund development that's going to exacerbate flooding, that's going to contaminate these precious waterways.
Thank you so much, Catherine. David, anything to add before we move on to the next question?
Certainly. In our case, the living shorelines work, as well as the protective infrastructures such as oyster beds, seagrasses are going to be part of the focus of the work that we'll be doing with the National Fish and Wildlife Federation funds. Additionally, I had mentioned previously that there's people abandoning this space because I think they get tired of dealing with the flooding. And it appears that our city's strategy with widespread abandonment is to allow the invisible hand of the free market resolve the issue. So for us, this leaves a big opportunity, and this is why we've documented where the abandonment has occurred. We know that if we look at it on a GIS map, we can see the relationship between the community's observations of areas that flood overlaid with the spaces that we've documented that have already been abandoned. And so there's correlation there. And so we've actually turned to the US EPA and a program that got called the Regionally Directed Technical Assistance. It's not a fund, it's just technical assistance that brownfields communities are able to tap. So we tapped it, and they're helping us create sort of prototypical uses of 170 sites that have been documented that are abandoned. You might call them public nuisance sites or potential public nuisance sites. And so in the areas where it's flooding, it seems to make sense to not put housing there, but to actually use the lands there for another purpose, such as rain gardens, and to sink the water rather than spread it out across cement or try to push it out to sea with tubes that will become obsolete with time, and pumps that just frankly don't get maintained and don't switch on when they're supposed to. And so the opportunity here is for the community to really take control and to seize the opportunities that we have with space abandonment in areas that have higher elevations, well, perhaps to relocate people from lower elevations to higher elevations. But also we have to face the reality that these processes are slow, and people are experiencing flooding on a regular basis. It's a chronic problem. And already the other mechanism besides relocating with FEMA, which is a possibility that we are exploring as we survey home to home, people who are being flooded and asking what they want to do. But there's also another mechanism, and that's being funded through CDBG disaster recovery funds and a Puerto Rico-based program called R3, Repair, Rebuild, Relocate. There are 20 homes across our 11,000 person barrio who have been told by our territorial government that the territory is not going to help them repair or rebuild. And so they have to relocate. So they've received things called vouchers. And the unfortunate piece is, not just here in Puerto Rico, but elsewhere in the world, there's a real housing shortage. And people are not able to find homes in which they are able to qualify and use these vouchers. We've had deep conversations, very difficult conversations with some of our neighbors about the challenges that they're facing. And so we hope to be able to give them better options.
Thank you so much, David. We have a question from Winifred Victor Hines asking if the local government has addressed these issues or attempted to mitigate them either in master plans or zoning laws, and whether local government have a department or office that helps residents tackle these issues.
Catherine should answer that.
Yeah. The short, truthful answer is no. The Forest Heights community pleaded for years for a levy. There's some controversy about the levy. There was a levy, and then there wasn't a levy. And so now, after planning this massive road development that will actually lead to destruction of hundreds of acres of precious wetlands. Now the local city government is finally looking at having a levy, but it's kind of attached to, again, a road development situation. And the people want the levy, but they don't want this road development. So, they're proposing this really, something that the community has wanted for quite some time. And they didn't get it until the opposition for the road came up, this road development. And so it's like dangling, and it's like this implied, if you stop opposing this road, then maybe you'll get your levy. And that's quite unfair, because the community wants a road. The community actually developed a community plan right after Katrina. They worked with EPA and DOT. They worked with local, state, and federal government to develop this 200-page community plan that's just kind of been put on the shelf now. However, we're taking it off, and we're going to update that community plan, and we're going to go back to these agencies and say, listen, this is what we worked together, and this is what we plan, and this is the updated plan, and we'd like to follow it, and we'd like you to continue your support of this plan. So yes, as far as the zoning, it's very difficult because our state environmental regulatory agency says that they base their permitting on the zoning, and that if it comes before them, they're more than likely going to permit it if it is zoned. And the zoning in Gulfport and the communities that we serve have not been changed since Jim Crow segregation relegated these communities. They could not live anywhere. They could not build anywhere else.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to talk.
Would you like me to
sorry.
also comment?
Yes, please.
Sure. So to repeat what Catherine just said, also the short answer is no. The challenges with the levees, we've got a levee right behind my home, about 10-minute walk from us, is that the Corps of Army Engineers will build these and then they transfer them to a local authority for maintenance. And the maintenance is not funded, doesn't happen. Yet this levy is protecting, I think the number that I saw, $700 million worth of real estate. And so the governance challenges of maintaining this infrastructure are very problematic. I don't have a solution for that. The master plan, ours is more than 30 years old, but we are also seeing interest from global capital flows, i.e. foreign investors, looking at the devalued lands because of the inaction and seeing an opportunity for tourism and creating a wonderful port for mega yachts and all of this luxury that of course isn't for any of us. And then yes, the zoning laws exist, but the enforcement sadly is very underfunded. And we also have a local cultural practice of using social capital as well as local human capital in construction projects. So maybe people will build in some circumstances without permits, and that the homes are adapted for climate based on how much money people have in their pockets and what they're allowed to produce based on that kind of investment. So it's a real challenge.
Thank you. I want to turn now, David, you mentioned the flooding of a sewage treatment plant in Ponce. And I know that many of the communities that are flood prone are also hotspots for heavy industry, whether it's petrochemical industry, whether I'm not sure who mentioned brownfields, maybe Catherine. Invite anyone on the panel who wants to talk about the intersection of flooding and contamination and how some of the solutions that you're working on will address both. And this question was inspired, by the way, by Mary Beth Armstrong.
I'm happy. So when we first got started, when we first launched Anthropocene Alliance in 2017, we were just working with flood impacted communities. That was something I had more of a background on. So I wanted to kind of get started with flood impacted communities. And what was interesting is when you start working with flood impacted communities, you start working with environmentally contaminated communities as well. But I mean, particularly when you're focused on low income communities, there's such a strong crossover between, I guess, flood risks, flooding, and development of petrochemical industry, Superfund sites, mining, logging, destruction of wetlands for that. And so, we were addressing the flooding. Obviously, you need to do two things. You need to address the flooding. You need to halt the stuff that's making it worse. Both Catherine and David have talked about that. If you continue to destroy wetlands, you're simply, imagine the rain gardens and the community food gardens that Catherine's plan of action can put in place versus the destruction of hundreds of acres of wetlands. But those wetlands also have that critical role. And so we've been helping both, I think, Catherine and David look at those sources of contamination as well. So trying to halt often. So, in Catherine's case, we were trying to halt a development on a former fertilizer site that would have leached onto the wetlands that would have then doubled not only the flooding, but then the sources of contamination, both into the creek, which is so critical to the viability of the wetlands, but then on into people's homes. So this overlap happens again and again. We're helping another group of residents in Pascagoula, Mississippi. They want to get out of the city because they're being killed through poison, but we're trying to use the flood mechanism to help them relocate because that's where more of the money is.
And adding on to that, I think Harriet makes such a good point. And what we see that's really interesting is these issues are so linked, right? Flooding and water quality. But when you look at how they're administered at the state, local, and federal level, they're often very different departments, right? So you have totally different people who are thinking about water quality and then thinking about flooding. So it can be really hard to get support and funding for projects that actually do both, even though when everyone's laying them out, and you give us the vision of, do you want a community garden or the destruction of all those wetlands? It's so obvious. The one thing I'll say that's interesting is knowing the overlap, we've been able to see some really interesting solutions. We don't talk a lot about some of the agricultural areas in the middle of the country, but we're doing some pilots in Iowa where we actually have 2 test farm sites, one in Northeast Iowa, one in Guthrie Center. And we found that by supporting farmers who are doing multi-cropping, which is just planting, a secondary crop, you get more root systems. We've actually measured and we can reduce flooding 40 to 60%. And really importantly, if you keep the water there and you have healthier soil, you can both reduce the pesticides you need to put on up front and you're preventing the runoff that's creating the water quality issues. But one thing we found is it's really hard to get people to think about and fund all of those benefits together because you have folks who care about the water quality and regulating that, you have folks who care about flooding, and it's really hard to intermingle those funding streams to get what are really obvious solutions. Our farmers can be on the forefront of fixing both of these problems, and it's incredibly cheap flood mitigation. It keeps pollutants out of waterways, but I think that's what we're up against is getting people to kind of think about this differently.
I would say that in Playa de Ponce that a couple of things have happened. You mentioned in particular, Nicole, the sewage. So the community in 2016 documented the fecal bacteria levels in public water bodies that pass through the neighborhood, and also began advocating with the US EPA for enforcement action for this sewage and stormwater blending that occurs in front of some neighborhoods and then gets pumped out to sea, which is, an apparent Clean Water Act violation. And because of the advocacy and the constant year after year pressure from neighbors, the EPA, along with the DOJ, is in negotiations now with PRASA, which is our Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, as well as the municipality, which has delegated authorities over the stormwater sewage systems that roll through the community, to actually take, court supervised action to fix these issues. We still have the challenge that there is very little communication back to the community about what's going on with these negotiations. We'd asked the regional administrator from EPA to provide a place at the table with the community's interests at heart. And as far as we understand, that has not yet happened. So we're still looking forward to that. And then in terms of the funding that could be available to repair the sewage water issues in the neighborhood, well, the Biden administration has just made a record influx for state revolving loan funds for water all across the nation, including Puerto Rico. And so the money's there, but we do need to have plans in place to be able to, seize the day and take care of these issues. And that, unfortunately, we don't have those plans yet. And hopefully those will come forward very quickly.
Thank you, David. And Melissa, I appreciate you bringing up the issue of flooding and the number of flood solutions in rural and natural areas. Obviously, we focused here today on urban flooding, but, many of the parts of the country that have experienced, historic snow melt or rains are forested or farmed. And of course, there's a lot of work to do on those landscapes as well to help soak and slow the water as opposed to having it run off. One last question, and then we'll wrap up. And for those that have to hop off, I just want to say again that we are going to send out the recording and transcript after this call, just as soon as they're ready. And we'll also provide contact information if you have follow-up questions for the panelists. Question from Ramona Taylor Williams for Catherine, asking whether you see buyouts as another form of urban renewal, and if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. And a lot of the residents fear that as well. That the gentrification of areas, and we have seen that happen where, once people have participated in buyouts, then they come back, they put in all the controls, all the flood controls needed, and then, they develop it and make it happen. It's a prime area. The North Gulfport area is very close to the airport. It's a very good location, and with just a little investment in these areas, and if you stop some of this development, because with all the development there was a lot of development, a lot of growth in that area after Hurricane Katrina, because people wanted to move away from the Gulf. They wanted to move north of there. So that's exacerbated flooding issues. And now these other developments, as Harriet mentioned, one that they want to put on the former site, of the site of I'm going to say the contaminated site of a former fertilizer plant, which is going to further contaminate Turkey Creek. You still have people, because they grew up fishing in Turkey Creek, that will still risk eating, the fish from the Turkey Creek. Testing has shown that it's had fecal matter, coliform, and but sometimes people are desperate and that's their only source of food, and so they have no other choice but to risk eating from the creek. It used to be an area for swimming, for boating. And so we certainly, the ideal plan is to have the creek restored, have those wetlands restored. And if we can stop some of the fill and build, then that could happen. And, people can stay in their homes. They can stay in these areas. They can retain the history. Turkey Creek, Forest Heights is over 50 years old. So we're looking into getting it on the historic registry. Turkey Creek is already on the historical registry. So we are now going to try and get a little more protection, but we found out that lately they're not getting as much protection being on the historical registry when it comes to these developments.
Harriet, were you raising your hand to add something? Okay. Well, thank you so much to Catherine, David, Melissa, and Harriet for joining us. Thanks to all those who joined to listen and ask questions. As I said, I'm sorry we didn't get to every single question, but I will send out the recording and transcript as well as contact information for the panelists if you'd like to follow up. Have a great day, you all.